from Texas.
Mr. President, I had intended to give remarks and then promulgate a series of unanimous consent requests. However, the Majority Leader requested for purposes of scheduling that I begin with the unanimous consent request, which I'm happy to do so to accommodate his schedule. But I would ask that at the conclusion of these unanimous consent requests, I would ask unanimous consent that I be given 20 minutes to speak at the conclusion of this to lay out the reasons why I believe the majority should accede to these unanimous requests.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
So the first unanimous consent request I would promulgate, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.J. Res. 72, making continuing appropriations for veterans' benefits for the fiscal year 2014, which was received from the House. I ask further consent that the measure be read 3 times and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. The junior senator from Texas has offered a unanimous consent that we take care of veterans in this shutdown of government. Mr. President, I would note that there is no senator or member of Congress here who doesn't care deeply about making sure that our veterans are taken care of, including this senator from the state of Washington. As the presiding officer knows and our colleagues know, I have spoken often of my own father, who was a World War II veteran, who spent most of his life in a wheelchair, earned a Purple Heart. I know the sacrifices that our veterans make. As chair of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee before this, I fought hard to make sure every veteran had what they needed, that we said more than just thank you, but we provided them for what they need. So I know our veterans well. And what I do know about our veterans, Mr. President, is that they, above everyone else, are selfless. They went to serve our country and said, we will take care of the rest of you at our own personal sacrifice. They would be the last to come before us and say, take care of me before everyone else. They would say to us, take care of our fellow men and leave no one behind. So, Mr. President, I am going to ask that the senator modify his request and do what our military has always asked us to, their fellow men to do, and leave no one behind. A request that will assure that everyone who fights for our country, takes care of our country, works for our country in emergencies, depends on our country to make sure that they have the opportunity every one of us had here, is able to have that opportunity, and they're not held hostage to a government shutdown, so that we can get back to work and solve our country's problems. We need to end this Tea Party shutdown, and we can do it with the request that I will ask right now. So I have a modification to suggest to the junior senator from Texas request. I ask consent that his request be modified as follows: that an amendment, which is at the desk, be agreed to, that the joint resolution as amended then be read a 3rd time and passed, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate. This amendment is the text that has passed the Senate and is a clean, continuing resolution for the entire government, and is something that is already over in the House and reportedly has now the support of the majority of the members of the House of Representatives.
Does the senator from Texas so modify his request?
Reserving the right to object, I thank my friend from Washington State. I note that she talked about leaving no man or woman behind. And I would note that the continuing resolution that the House has passed to fully fund the Veterans Administration treats our veterans the same way the House and Senate have already treated active duty military. Just a few days ago, this body unanimously passed a bill that said the men and women of the military would be paid. Unfortunately, it seems to be the position of the majority in this body that veterans should be treated not as well as our active duty military, and in particular, that the full funding of the VA should be held hostage to every other priority that the Democrats in this chamber must have. I understand the Democrats in this chamber are committed to Obamacare with all of their heart, might, and soul. But the veterans of this nation should not be held hostage to that commitment. It is likely, given the majority's refusal to negotiate, refusal to compromise, refusal even to talk to find a middle ground, it is likely that this shutdown instigated by the Democratic majority will continue for some time. And during that time, we ought to be able to find common ground that at the very minimum, our veterans shouldn't pay the price. If moments from now, my friend from Washington simply does not object, by the end of the day, the VA will be fully funded. If, as we all expect, she does object, if she repeats the objection that her majority leader and her party has made throughout the course of this week, then much of the VA will remain shut down because of that objection. So she has asked if we can reopen the entire federal government, and if she doesn't get if the request is not granted to give every single priority in the federal government that the majority party wants, that the VA will remain without sufficient funds. I find that highly objectionable, and I object.
Is there objection to the original request?
Mr. President, I object on behalf of all Americans who should not be left behind.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, the second unanimous consent request I would promulgate. I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 3230, making continuing appropriations during a government shutdown to provide pay and allowances for members of the reserve components of the armed forces, which was received from the House. I ask further consent that the measure be read 3 times and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object.
The Assistant Majority Leader.
Mr. President, the junior senator from Texas launched this government shutdown with a 21-hour presentation here on the floor of the United States Senate, and it is clear from the actions of the House and his actions today that he is starting to try to reconcile in his mind all the damage which this government shutdown, which he inspired, is causing across the United States. This particular unanimous consent request relates to the National Guard and Reservists, a group which we hold in high esteem. But if the gentleman from Texas is really focused on veterans and those who've served our country, take into consideration the 560,000 federal employees who are currently facing furlough or on furlough, who are veterans, a fourth of whom are disabled veterans. So what the junior senator from Texas is doing is picking and choosing those he will allow in the lifeboat. At this moment, it's National Guard and Reserve. Leave 560,000 veteran federal employees out in the water thrashing for themselves. That is not the way we should manage or govern this country. I can understand the anxiety you feel about the problems you have created, but trying to solve them one piece at a time is not the American way. I object. And I ask unanimous consent, though, before I object. I ask unanimous consent that your request be modified, that an amendment which is at the desk be agreed to, that the bill be amended, then be read a 3rd time and passed, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate. This amendment is the text that passed the Senate, is a clean, continuing resolution for the entire government, National Guard, Reserve, VA, NIH, all of them. It's something that's already over in the House of Representatives and reportedly has the support of a majority of Democrats and Republicans and could pass today. I ask for that modification.
Will the senator so modify his request?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. No one watching these proceedings should be confused. We are in a shutdown because President Obama and the majority leader of this body want a shutdown because they believe it is in the partisan interest of their party to have a shutdown. 4 times the House of Representatives has compromised. 4 times the House of Representatives has endeavored to meet a middle ground. And 4 times the majority leader and every Democrat in this body has said, no, we will not talk, we will not compromise, we will not have a middle ground. 100% of the priorities of the Democrats in this body must be funded or they will insist on a shutdown. Now, I thank my friend from Illinois for making clear that the members of the reserve components of our armed forces, in his judgment, are not worthy of being paid during this shutdown that the Democrats have forced. I could not disagree with that judgment more strongly. And let us be clear. This bill that has passed the House doesn't mention Obamacare, has nothing to do with Obamacare. It simply says the exact same thing that my friend from Illinois already agreed to, which is that the active duty men and women of the military would not be held hostage and would be paid if it so happened that the Democrats forced a shutdown. Now, apparently the position of the majority of this body is that we've got a double standard, that reserve members are not treated as well as active duty members, that reserve members will not get their paychecks. And let's be clear that this bill could be on the president's desk for signature today if my friend from Illinois would simply withdraw his objection. Unfortunately, in a move that I think reflects a level of cynicism not befitting of the responsibility all of us have, my friend is prepared to object and to say that not just veterans, but reserve members shall be held hostage in order to force Obamacare on the American people. That is the objective. I guess now the Democratic Party has become the party of Obamacare, by Obamacare, and for Obamacare all of the time. And every other priority recedes. So veterans are told, your concerns do not matter unless we can use you to force Obamacare on the American people. Reserve military members are told, your concerns do not matter unless we can use you as a hostage to force Obamacare on the American people. Mr. President, that's cynical. We ought to take these individuals off the table. I would note that my friend from Illinois noted the great many federal employees who have been furloughed. I would be very happy to work in a bipartisan manner to cooperate with my friend from Illinois to bring a great many of those federal employees back to their vital responsibilities. But unfortunately, the position the Democratic Party has made is not a one of them will be allowed to come back until this body agrees to force Obamacare on the American people, despite the jobs lost, despite the people being forced into part-time work, despite the skyrocketing health insurance premiums, and despite the millions of people losing or at risk of losing their health insurance. Mr. President, I find that highly objectionable, and I object.
Objection is heard. Is there objection to the original request?
Mr. President, I would say to my colleague from Texas, some of the language which he has used in this debate relative to impugning the motives of other members may have crossed the line. I'm not going to raise it at this point, but I ask him to be careful in the future. I object.
Objection is heard. For the edification of all senators, Rule 19 reads as follows. No senator in debate shall directly or indirectly by any form of words impute to another senator or to other senators any conduct or motive unworthy of becoming or unbecoming a senator.
Mr. President, I now promulgate my third unanimous consent request. I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.J. Res. 70, making continuing appropriations for National Park Service operations, which was received from the House. I ask further consent that the measure be read 3 times and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
Senator from New York.
Mr. President, and I will object, but let me just say a couple of things here. First, in reference to the colloquy he had with the senator from Texas had with my good friend from Washington State, he said that he notes that the senator from Washington talks about leaving no man or no woman behind. She does indeed. And that is one of the reasons so many of us oppose this piecemeal approach. It's leaving lots of people behind. The bottom line is the junior senator from Texas has advocating shutting down the government. And now he comes before us and says, well, why don't you pass the parts of the government that I want to open? No one would want to do that. Makes no sense. Let's shut down the government, and then I'll come to the floor and be magnanimous and offer a few places where the government opens. I note that no other colleagues are standing here on the floor with him. I'd note that at least according to press reports, most of the many conservative colleagues in this body reject this approach. And I would note that it would make no sense to shut down the government and pick a few groups. Who wants to shut the government down? In my view, Mr. President, it is the Tea Party. They've said it all along. They've advocated for it. There are countless instances where even in 2010, Tea Party folks said, let's shut the government down. And then it is said, after the government is shut down, that President Obama or this side or the senator from Illinois caused it, when we had a bipartisan resolution with a majority on this side. There was an opportunity. I believe the junior senator from Texas urged his colleagues to vote against that resolution, but 25 of them did not. And that kept the government open here in the Senate. There were many, everyone on this side, the other side of the aisle opposes Obamacare. But the majority didn't want to use a bludgeon and say, unless you reject Obamacare, we're going to shut the government down, or for that matter, not raise the debt ceiling. We are not, Mr. President, in an Alice in Wonderland world, where those who advocate shutting the government down then accuse others of shutting the government down. That isn't washing with the American people, and it won't wash in this body with the vast majority of members of both sides of the aisle. And so I would say to my colleague, if you wish to have a debate on what parts of the government should be funded and at what level, it is wrong, in my opinion, to say shut the government down and then we'll decide piece by piece which we open. That's Alice in Wonderland, in my judgment. I would rather, it makes much more sense to have the government open and then have a debate in the proper place, a conference committee that decides future funding in an omnibus appropriations bill, what level of funding, if any, each part of the government should get. So to first deprive our national parks of dollars by advocating shutting the government down, and then accuse others who don't want to leave 98% of the government behind, and of the people who work there behind, and of the American people who depend on so many other programs, whether it's student loans or feeding the hungry, is wrong. And so I would ask consent that the request be modified as follows: that an amendment which is at the desk be agreed to, that the joint resolution be amended, then be read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate. This amendment is the text that passed the Senate and is a clean, continuing resolution for the entire government, actually leaving no man or woman behind, and is something that is already over in the House and has the support, reportedly, of a majority of members of the House, including members of both parties. So would the senator agree to modify his request?
Does the senator agree to so modify his request?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I thank the senator from New York for his heartfelt concern for the Republican Party. And I note that the senator from New York stated that I, quote, have advocated shutting down the government. That statement, unfortunately, is a flat-out falsehood, and I know the senator from New York would not do so knowingly, so it must have been a mistaken statement. Because throughout the course of this debate, I have said repeatedly in every context, we should not shut the government down. A shutdown is a mistake, and I very much hoped that the majority leader would not force a shutdown on this country. We are in a shutdown because the Democrats in this body have refused to negotiate, refused to compromise. And I would note as well, I am quite grateful for the majority leader's admonition this morning towards civility on the floor, and the senator from Illinois' admonition towards Rule 19. That is an admonition well heard. Indeed, it was quite striking. You know, it has been several days since I have been to the floor of the Senate, and yet I feel that I have been here in absentia because so many Democrats have invoked my name as the root of all evil in the world. And indeed, the same majority leader that gave an ode to civility just a few days ago was describing me and anyone who might agree that we should stop the harms of Obamacare, describing us as, quote, anarchists. So I think the encouragement towards civility is an encouragement that should be heard across the board. And I would note also that my friends on the Democratic side of the aisle have described what they claim to be as the piecemeal approach as following my priorities. Several Democrats have used that language publicly. And I must note, Mr. President, I find it really quite ironic, because if I were to stand up here and say, it is my priority and not the priority of the Democrats to fund veterans, it is my priority and not the priority of the Democrats to fund the National Guard, it is my priority and not the priority of the Democrats to fund our national parks, it is my priority and not the priority of the Democrats to fund research for health care, they would quite rightly be able to rise and claim under Rule 19 that I was impugning their motives. I cannot imagine a greater insult than to claim it is not the priority of members of this body to treat fairly our veterans. And yet what I find so striking is that so many Democrats go out publicly and embrace that. They say funding the veterans is Cruz's priority, not ours. And yet I'll note, even on that front, the funding proposals that the House of Representatives has passed are not even the House's priorities, although under the Constitution they have a legitimate role laying out their priorities for funding. They are President Obama's priorities. Just a few days ago, the President gave a speech to this country, a speech that all of us watched closely, in which the President said that if a shutdown occurred, quote, veterans who sacrifice for their country will find their support centers unstaffed. The President also said, with regard to parks, as we're discussing now, in memorials, quote, tourists will find every one of America's national parks and monuments, from Yosemite to the Smithsonian to the Statue of Liberty, immediately closed. And to the credit of the House of Representatives, they listened to the President's speech, they listened to President Obama's priorities, and the House of Representatives acted with bipartisan cooperation. They said, Mr. President, we have heard your priorities, let's fund them. Let's work together. I would note my friend from Maryland a moment ago gave a speech about how important it is, he thinks, that we should fund food inspectors in the Department of Agriculture and also our intelligence community. And I would note with my friend from Maryland, I fully agree with him, and indeed would be happy to work arm in arm and to fund the intelligence community, fully fund them today. The only impediment to that happening is that the Democrats in this body are objecting. And that is what should be abundantly clear. When it comes to parks, when it comes to memorials, we've all read about World War II veterans being turned away from the World War II memorial. We've all read about Mount Vernon, which is privately owned, the federal government blocking the parking lot.
Mr. President,
Your leader.
I ask permission to direct a question to the chair to my friend from Texas.
Does the senator yield for a question?
I'm happy to yield for a question from the majority leader.
Majority leader.
Mr. President, my question is that I was under the assumption that my friend would offer the consent agreements. We would give, as we do here, brief responses into the competing consent agreements, and then the Senate would speak for 20 minutes. My only concern is this. 1, 2, 3. I have 5 or 6 senators over here wishing to speak. So my question is this. Do you wish to take 20 minutes following this, in addition to what time you've taken now?
Senator from Texas.
I thank the majority leader for his question. At his request, I began with these unanimous consent requests, and it was my intention to keep my remarks at the end, but I would note that in each of the objections, my friends on the Democratic side of the aisle have chosen to stand up and give their remarks. And if the remarks are to be given by the Democrats, then it is certainly appropriate that some response be given. And so if the courtesy the majority leader was asking was that none of the remarks that his friends and colleagues make have any response, that was not a courtesy I was prepared to give. I was prepared to, and am prepared to work and cooperate on timing, but not to allow only one side of the discussion to be presented.
Further, Mr. President, I ask then to propound a unanimous consent request when the request this, when the senator from Texas finishes his consent that he's asking, and there's one more as I understand it, then I ask permission the next senators to be recognized. Senator Mikulski for
10 minutes.
Senator Mikulski for 10 minutes. Senator from Florida. Senator So it's not bad, only a couple to speak. So we have Senator Mikulski will be recognized for up to 15 minutes. So I apologize for the interruption. The floor is the senators from Texas.
Without objection. Senator from Texas, is there objection to the modification?
The modification.
Is there objection to the modification of your consent request by the senator from New York?
Reserving the right to object. The modification that the senator from New York has suggested is that he is unwilling to open our national parks, to open our memorials, unless every other aspect of the government is opened immediately and Obamacare is forced upon the American people. That is, quite simply and directly saying that the Senate will not respond to President Obama's priorities. President Obama gave a speech to this country saying we should open our parks, we should open our memorials. The House of Representatives said, Mr. President, we the Republicans will work with you to do that. And today the Democrats in the Senate are objecting and saying, no, we want every park closed, every memorial closed. All of that will be held hostage until Obamacare is forced on every American. I find that highly objectionable, and I object.
Objection is heard. Is there objection to the original request?
Reserving the right to object, and I'll be brief.
Senator from New York.
I just want to make this point. The junior senator from Texas has said that it is President Obama and the Democrats who are shutting the government down. My modification, which he just objected to, would open up the entire government. We put it on the floor. We're all for it. He objected to it. Therefore, I will object to the junior senators from Texas's proposal.
The objection is heard. Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, the forced unanimous consent request that I would promulgate, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.J. Res. 73, making continuing appropriations for the National Institutes of Health for fiscal year 2014. I ask further consent that the measure be read 3 times and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Prior to my responding to my friend, I would use just a few minutes of leader time, and it's very brief. With the permission, here's what I'm going to say. Mr. President, we've heard this back and forth stuff about veterans, but let's also, in addition to what the senator from Washington said, let me read one paragraph from the record of yesterday. I would also note that I believe the resolution the Senator is offering and suggested to be passed provides only partial funding for the VA. There is no funding here to operate the national cemeteries. There's no funding for the Board of Veterans Appeals. There's no funding for constructing VA hospitals and the clinics. There's no funding actually to operate the IT system that the entire VA needs in order to continue going forward. Mr. President, I reserve the right to object to my friend from Texas' request. I object, as do most Americans. There's no reason for us to have to choose between the important government functions, as has been said by my 3 colleagues so brilliantly this morning. But I guess my objection is best paraphrased by reading a column from the Washington Post by Dana Milbank. Here's what he said. House Republicans continue what might be called the lifeboat strategy, deciding which government functions are worth saving. In, veterans, the troops and tourist attractions. Out, poor children, pregnant women, and just about every government function that regulates business. Here are some of the functions not boarding the GOP lifeboats. Market regulation, chemical spill investigations, antitrust enforcement, worksite immigration checks, workplace safety inspections, the Environmental Protection Agency, communications, trade regulation, nutrition for 9 million children and pregnant women, flu monitoring, and other functions of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and housing rental assistance for the poor. Now, Mr. President, I spent a month ago a day at the National Institutes of Health. I remember so clearly one institute I went to where this young girl, about 12 years old, she had come back for her 2nd visit. She had a disease they really didn't know for sure what it is, but they were trying to figure out what she had. And they felt that they were on the cusp of being able to figure that out. And that parents, of course, were very, very happy. Mr. President, we know how important it is that little children, babies, adults be taken care of, especially toward the time when they have no hope. That's what the NIH is about, hope. And so, Mr. President, I really believe that we should open the government, all the government. This is a trip down a road that is so foolish. We need not be there. If people have problems with Obamacare, and I know my friend, this junior senator from Texas, doesn't care for Obamacare. Let's do it in a context that's reasonable and fair, not have all the people in America who are so troubled with this. I heard an interview with the governor of Maryland this morning. They're losing $15 or $20 million a day because of the government being closed in Maryland. So, Mr. President, I would ask my friend to accept a modification, and it's a modification that is so well-intentioned. What it would do is open the government. It would take care of the National Institutes of Health. It would take care of the veterans, including all the stuff that's left out of the consent that we have here before the floor, which I read into the record a minute ago. It would take care of the national parks, which in Nevada, we are really desperate to have those. We have one 7-8 minutes out of Las Vegas. We have 1 million people a year visit that. We have one about 12 miles out of Las Vegas where we have 600,000 people a year visit that. Lake Mead, the other is Red Rock, and we have our Great Basin National Park. I want to open that. Mr. President, that would solve this problem like that. So I ask consent that my friend from Texas consent be modified, that an amendment which the desk be agreed to, that the joint resolution as amended be read a third time passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate. This amendment is the text that passed the Senate and is a clean, continuing resolution from the entire government and is something that's already over in the House and reportedly has the support of the majority of members of the House of Representatives. Finally, Mr. President, the statement I made, that little girl, if she came back there now for her clinical trial, likely she wouldn't be able to have any help, just as we learned earlier this week that there are 200 people who were turned away from clinical trials, 30 of which were babies and children.
Does the senator agree to so modify his original request?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I would note that the majority leader made a plea for compromise. And I think most Americans want to see a compromise. The House of Representatives has repeatedly compromised already. The House began, it is the view of every Republican in this body, and indeed every Republican in the House, that Obamacare should be entirely and completely repealed. Nonetheless, the House started with a compromise of saying not repealing Obamacare, but simply that it should be defunded. They funded the entire federal government and defunded Obamacare. It came to the Senate, and the majority leader and 54 Democrats voted in lockstep to say, no, absolutely not, we won't talk, we won't compromise. The House then came with a second compromise. They said, fine, if the Senate will not agree to fully defund Obamacare, then let's all agree to a reasonable one-year delay. President Obama has already delayed Obamacare for big business. Let's treat hardworking American families at least as well as big business. Let's have a one-year delay because we're seeing how badly this thing is working. Now, that's a big compromise from defunding. It came over to the Senate, and the majority leader and 54 Senate Democrats said, no, absolutely not. We will not talk. We will not compromise. Shut the government down. The House came back a third time and said, okay, how about we simply delay the individual mandate, one small portion of Obamacare, and we revoke the congressional exemption that President Obama illegally gave members of this Congress to exempt us from the burdens of Obamacare that are inflicted on millions of Americans. Now, Mr. President, that offer represented an enormous compromise from the view of Republicans that Obamacare should be repealed in its entirety. And what did the Senate say? Did the Senate say, let's sit down and work something out? Did the Senate say, let's find a middle ground? No. The majority leader and the 54 Senate Democrats said, absolutely not. No, we will not talk. We will not compromise. Shut the government down. And that's why the government is shut down right now. Just a moment ago, the Majority Leader gave his latest offer. It was give us everything we demanded, 100%, no compromise, no middle ground. That is the position of the Democrats in this body. Mr. President, that's not a reasonable position. That's not the way people work together to find a middle ground. You know, it was reported that the Majority Leader urged the President not even to talk to congressional leaders. Now, the President apparently had a change of heart and sat down with congressional leaders and had what, by all accounts, was an extraordinary conversation where President Obama told congressional leaders, I called you over here to say I'm not going to talk to you. I am not going to negotiate. I must admit, that's a remarkable conversation to call someone over to say, hi, good to see you, we're not going to talk. Mr. President, if this matter is going to be resolved, we need to see good faith among members on both sides. Republicans have repeatedly been offering compromises to resolve this shutdown, and unfortunately, the behavior of the majority party in this body has been my way or the highway, and one can only assume that their stated public belief, as what actually a senior administration official from the Obama administration said, we think we're winning politically. I'm paraphrasing, but we don't care when the shutdown ends. That's a paraphrase. It's not exact, but that was certainly the thrust of the statement from what was described as a senior administration official. I think that's cynical. I think that's partisan. I don't think that's what we should be doing. So I wish the Majority Leader and the Democrats would accede to what should be shared bipartisan priorities, but it appears right now that they are not, that their position is give us everything, fully fund Obamacare, and force it on the American people. That I cannot consent to, and so I object.
The objection is heard. Is there objection to the original request?
Mr. President, still reserving my right to
Majority
object.
Leader.
Mr. President, my friend from Texas, and I have developed a relationship with him, talks about a meeting that he didn't attend. The senator from Texas did not attend. I was there. I was one of 5 people. The President, Speaker Boehner, Leader McConnell, Leader Pelosi, and me. Oh, I do, yes, the Vice President was there also, I'm sorry. Now, Mr. President, I attended that meeting. The President didn't say, come on in, I'm not going to talk to you, I have nothing to say. Words to that effect. Meeting lasted an hour and 20 minutes. There was a lot of things said. But one thing that wasn't said is this Alice in Wonderland, what took place in that meeting, who talks about the meeting that wasn't there. So, Mr. President, let's talk about compromise. My friend brought up compromise. We have before us a continuing resolution. My friend, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, John Boehner, called me and said, we've got to work this out. We've got to get this done quickly. And I thought, so how are we going to get it done? This was on September 9th, after our recess ended. He said, we've got to have 788 number, the number for this year. 988, I'm sorry, thank you, 988. I said, I can't do that. I can't do that. Chairman Murray's number is $70 billion above that we passed here in the Senate. We passed it. I can't agree to 988. He said, you got to do it. I don't want a big fight. I want to get this done. So I talked to Chairman Murray, Chairman Mikulski, and others, and even though it was desperately hard to do, because we don't like the number of 988. We don't like it. It's not our number. We agreed to do it. That was a compromise. Mr. President, I've been in Congress 31 years, and that's the biggest compromise I've ever made. My caucus didn't like it, but we did it in an effort to have a clean CR. You talk about compromise, that was big time. But Speaker Boehner, I'm sure he was well-intentioned, he couldn't get it done. He couldn't get it done. It was his idea how to get it done. Then, Mr. President, talk about further compromise. One of the last things we had walked over from the House is go to conference. So I thought, I have something that he can't, it's an offer that's so good he couldn't refuse it. What did I do? With the cooperation of all 53 Democratic senators, here's what we agreed to do. Open the government, and what we will do is go to conference, not on little select areas. We'll go to conference on, I listed everything, not everything, but everything I could think of. We listed agriculture, we listed discretionary spending, and yes, we listed health care. But I gave the letter to the Speaker, I talked to him 45 minutes later, and he said, I can't do it. Wow. So, Mr. President, I know what legislation's all about. It is the art of compromise. I understand that. And we have compromised in big-time fashion. The problem is the Speaker and some other Republican members of Congress are in a real bind because the only thing they want to talk about is a law that passed 4 years ago, the Supreme Court declared constitutional, which is a little unusual, I would think, my experience here. So we, Mr. President, are where we are because we not only have the government shut down, but we have the full faith and credit of our nation before us in a week or 10 days. So, Mr. President, I suggest I don't want anyone to say that I haven't compromised. All one needs to do is talk to any member of my caucus, and they will talk about how difficult it has been for us to accept that number and agree to go to conference on anything. So I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.